The neighborhood of Maple Ridge Estates looked like the kind of place people often described as perfect on paper. Wide, clean streets curved gently between rows of well-kept houses. Every lawn was trimmed with near-military precision, mailboxes stood in identical alignment, and the HOA sign at the entrance proudly displayed its motto, Pride, Order, Community. But beneath that polished surface, tension always had a way of growing quietly, like weeds under fresh paint. At the far end of Oakview Street stood a modest single-story home, slightly older than the others but carefully maintained. This was the home of Daniel Harris, a retired Vietnam War veteran in his late 70s. He lived alone, preferring silence over conversation, routine over chaos. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who caused trouble. He kept to himself, mowed his lawn on schedule, and always greeted neighbors with a small nod rather than long discussions. Most people in the neighborhood respected him, even if they didn't know much about him. But there was one thing everyone noticed when they passed his house. A single American flag hung proudly from a pole mounted beside his front porch. It wasn't new, it wasn't perfectly crisp. The fabric had faded slightly from years of sun exposure, and the edges showed subtle wear from wind and rain. But to Daniel, that flag wasn't decoration. It was memory, respect, and survival all woven into red, white, and blue. Few people knew the real reason it mattered so much to him. That flag had once flown over a small forward base in Vietnam, where Daniel had served during one of the most difficult periods of his life. It reminded him of the men he lost, the nights that never ended, and the promise he made to never forget those who didn't make it home. Every morning, he would step onto his porch, glance at it briefly, and continue with his day. No ceremony, no words, just quiet acknowledgement. Across the street lived a very different kind of resident. Linda Morgans, who everyone in the neighborhood had quietly nicknamed Karen, was a newly elected HOA board member. She was in her mid-40s, always neatly dressed, always carrying a clipboard or phone, and always watching. Linda believed deeply in structure, order, and compliance. In her mind, rules weren't suggestions, they were the foundation of a functioning community, and anyone who bent them, even slightly, was a problem waiting to happen. She had already earned a reputation. A neighbor's decorative garden gnome had been reported and removed. A teenager's basketball hoop had been flagged for visual obstruction. Even slightly uneven mailbox paint had triggered written warnings. At first, people thought she was just detail-oriented. But over time, the word strict stopped being enough. It became controlling. And Daniel's house had recently become her newest focus. It started subtly. Linda would slow her car when passing his home. Then she began taking photos. Not just one or two, but repeated images from different angles, as if building a case only she understood. The flag in particular seemed to bother her. One afternoon, she stopped by Daniel's property under the pretense of a friendly HOA reminder. She stood at the edge of his walkway, clipboard in hand, eyes fixed on the flag rather than Daniel himself. "It's showing signs of wear," she said flatly. "According to HOA guidelines, anything displayed on exterior property must be in proper condition." Daniel listened quietly, hands resting behind his back. "I've had that flag a long time," he replied calmly. "It's still important to me." Linda didn't soften. "I understand sentiment," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't, "but rules apply equally to everyone." Daniel simply nodded once, not arguing. He had dealt with authority figures before. He knew that arguing rarely changed minds, it only revealed emotions. "I'll think about it," he said, ending the conversation politely. But Linda didn't leave satisfied. As she walked back to her car, she glanced over her shoulder one more time at the flag. Her expression tightened slightly, as if she had already made a decision that didn't require Daniel's approval. That night, she submitted her first official HOA complaint. By morning, Daniel found a notice in his mailbox. It stated that his exterior display item was in violation of HOA aesthetic standards and required correction within 14 days. He read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it on his kitchen table. He didn't get angry, he didn't call anyone. He simply looked out his window toward the flag, standing still in the morning light. And for a brief moment, something in his expression changed, not frustration, not fear, but recognition. Because Daniel had lived long enough to know one simple truth. Problems rarely stayed small in places like this. And Linda Morgan had already stopped treating this like a simple rule violation. She was treating it like a mission. And that was when things quietly began to shift. The following week in Maple Ridge Estates began like any other, quiet, orderly, and carefully maintained on the surface. Lawns were trimmed, sprinklers clicked on at precise intervals, and the HOA reminder emails went out like clockwork. But beneath that calm routine, something had already started to tighten. Daniel Harris sat at his kitchen table that morning, the same folded notice still resting in the corner where he had placed it days earlier. He hadn't thrown it away. He hadn't responded either. Instead, he simply observed it the way he observed most problems in life, patiently, without reaction. Outside, the American flag still moved gently in the breeze. It had weathered worse than HOA letters. Across the street, Linda Morgan was already at work. For Linda, the situation was no longer about a single complaint. In her mind, it had become a matter of consistency and authority. If one violation was allowed to stand, others would follow. That was how disorder began. She opened her laptop early that morning and accessed the HOA management system. Her complaint had already been logged, but now she escalated it, adding photographs, timestamps, and a formal request for enforcement action. Her message was precise and cold. Resident Harris is non-compliant with exterior display standards. Item in question is visibly deteriorated and undermines community aesthetic integrity, requesting immediate enforcement review. She hit submit without hesitation. Then she leaned back in her chair, satisfied. To her, this wasn't personal, it was structure, it was duty. But Maple Ridge Estates was not a boardroom. It was a living neighborhood, and people had begun to notice the shift. By midday, whispers had started circulating among neighbors. At first, it was small talk over fences. "Did you hear, Mr. Harris got another notice? I thought that flag was fine, it's just a little faded right. Linda's really pushing this one hard." No one said anything too loudly. That was the way things worked in HOA communities. Concerns were often shared in hushed tones rather than public confrontation. Daniel, meanwhile, remained unchanged in his routine. He watered his small front garden, he checked his mail, he sat on his porch in the late afternoon, watching cars pass by. If he noticed the increased attention, he didn't show it. But there was one thing he did notice: the frequency of Linda's presence. She began driving past his house more often than usual, sometimes slowly, sometimes pausing just long enough to look. Once he caught her standing across the street taking photos again, this time zooming in on the flag as if documenting evidence for something far larger than a simple HOA issue. Daniel didn't confront her. He simply remembered. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, Linda returned in person. She walked up Daniel's driveway with the same clipboard, the same controlled posture, and the same measured expression. This time, however, there was a sharper edge in her tone. "I received your notice," Daniel said before she could speak. Linda nodded. "Then you're aware of the violation." Daniel looked at her calmly. "It's a flag." "It's an exterior display item," she corrected, "and it does not meet community standards." He paused for a moment, studying her face, not with anger, but with something closer to quiet understanding. "It's been there a long time," he said again. Linda didn't blink. Length of time doesn't override compliance. A faint silence settled between them, the kind that often comes right before a misunderstanding becomes a conflict. Daniel glanced briefly at the flag behind him, then back at her. "It represents something important," he said softly. Linda shifted her weight slightly, already losing patience. "Sentimental value isn't part of the HOA guidelines." That sentence hung in the air longer than she intended. Daniel didn't argue further, he simply nodded once. "I understand," he said. But he didn't agree. Linda interpreted his calmness as resistance rather than reflection. "I'll be escalating this to the board," she added firmly. "If it's not corrected within the time frame, further action will be taken." With that, she turned and walked back down the driveway. Daniel watched her leave without moving. Only when she reached her car did he finally speak again, but not to her. "Some people see rules first," he said quietly to himself, "before they see people." That night, Linda submitted a second report, this one more urgent than the first. She recommended immediate HOA enforcement review and possible removal of the flag if compliance was not achieved. In her mind, she was protecting the neighborhood. But something subtle had begun to change. Because now, other residents were no longer just watching. They were starting to question. And Daniel Harris, still sitting quietly in his home as the evening settled in, had already made a decision of his own. He just hadn't acted on it yet. And when someone like Daniel stops reacting, it usually means he has started preparing. The first sign that something was wrong came just after sunrise. Maple Ridge Estates was still half asleep, wrapped in the soft gray light of early morning. Birds moved between rooftops, sprinklers hissed in slow rhythm, and the neighborhood carried its usual illusion of calm. But Daniel Harris noticed immediately that something felt off. From his kitchen window, his eyes went straight to the front yard. The flagpole was still there. But the flag was gone. For a few seconds he didn't move. He simply stared, as if waiting for it to reappear the way it always had, fluttering quietly in the morning breeze. It didn't. Daniel set his coffee down carefully, walked to the front door, and stepped outside. The air felt different somehow, heavier, quieter, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. He walked slowly to the flagpole. The hook was still intact, the rope was still tied, but the flag that had been there for years was gone completely, as if it had never existed. That's when he noticed something else. A faint, dark residue near the base of the pole. Not enough to be obvious to anyone passing by, but enough for someone who had lived through worse things to recognize that something had been deliberately removed, not lost. Daniel didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply stood there for a long moment, looking at the empty space where memory used to hang. Across the street, Linda Morgan was already at work again. She had been unusually active the night before. After filing her latest HOA escalation report, she decided the matter needed physical resolution. In her mind, the flag wasn't just non-compliant, it was a symbol of disorder that needed to be corrected decisively. And Linda believed in decisive action. What she did next, she would later describe as HOA enforcement demonstration. But what the neighborhood would eventually see was something very different. A neighbor's security camera, mounted above a garage 2 houses down, captured it all. Just after midnight, a car slowly pulled up near Daniel's home. The headlights dimmed, the driver stepped out. It was Linda. She moved with purpose, clipboard replaced by a rolled-up item tucked under her arm. She approached Daniel's porch, checked her surroundings, and then reached for the flag. There was no hesitation. She removed it from the pole and placed it into her vehicle. But she didn't stop there. Later footage captured from a second angle showed her in a quiet, unused section of a nearby lot where HOA maintenance equipment was sometimes stored. There, she unfolded the flag. And then, in what she later tried to justify as removal of damaged property, she set it ablaze inside a contained metal bin. The flames rose quickly against the night air. Red, white, and blue faded into smoke. No audience, no witnesses in person, just the sound of burning fabric and the quiet hum of a neighborhood that slept unaware of what was happening just a few streets away. But fire leaves traces, and cameras leave evidence. By morning, the video had already begun circulating among a few early risers who checked neighborhood security feeds out of habit or curiosity. By noon, nearly half the street had seen it. And by mid-afternoon, Maple Ridge Estates was no longer quiet. Daniel didn't react immediately when he was shown the footage. A neighbor, carefully hesitant, had come over and asked if he had seen his flag. Daniel simply listened as the video played on a phone. He watched it once, then again. Not a single word left his mouth during the entire recording. When it ended, he handed the phone back. "Thank you for showing me," he said calmly. That was all. But something in his expression had changed. Not anger in the explosive sense. Something colder, more deliberate. That evening, Linda Morgan held an emergency HOA discussion request, claiming miscommunication regarding property enforcement. But the tone around her had already shifted. Neighbors weren't just uncomfortable anymore, they were disturbed. "What gives her the right to do that?" someone whispered. That wasn't just a violation removal, that was something else. Even those who once supported strict HOA rules now hesitated. Because rules, they realized, were never meant to replace respect. And Linda had crossed a line that couldn't be easily redrawn. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone on his porch as the sun set. The empty flagpole stood beside him like a silent reminder of what had been taken. He didn't speak much that night. But he did make a phone call. One call. Short, direct, unemotional. And when he hung up, he looked once more at the empty pole. The wind moved through it differently now. Because something had shifted in Maple Ridge Estates. And what began as a complaint was no longer just an HOA issue anymore. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening, but the atmosphere in Maple Ridge Estates had already changed long before anyone stepped into the community hall. People weren't speaking in whispers anymore. They were speaking in disbelief. By late afternoon, the video had spread across nearly every household in the neighborhood. Some residents replayed it multiple times, trying to understand what they were seeing. Others refused to watch it again after the first viewing, disturbed by something they couldn't easily name. It wasn't just that the flag was removed. It was how easily it was done. And what followed. Inside the HOA meeting room, the air felt tight and uncomfortable. Linda Morgan sat at the front table, her clipboard still in hand, posture rigid as ever. Around her, board members shifted uneasily in their seats. For the first time since she had taken her position, she didn't have the same controlled confidence. But Linda didn't see herself as wrong. She saw herself as misunderstood. "We need to address misinformation circulating in the community," she began firmly, tapping her clipboard. "My actions were fully within HOA enforcement authority." A few murmurs moved through the room. One board member cleared his throat. "Linda, people saw the footage." "It was a removal of non-compliant property," she interrupted quickly. "The item was deteriorated and posed a visual standard violation." Another member leaned forward. "You entered his property at night." "That's irrelevant," she said sharply. HOA authority applies regardless of time when addressing enforcement concerns. Silence followed. It wasn't agreement. It was disbelief. Then a voice from the back spoke up. "Do you understand what that flag meant to him?" Linda didn't hesitate. Sentimental value does not override community guidelines. That sentence landed heavier this time. Because now it didn't sound like policy. It sounded like something else entirely. Before anyone could respond, the door at the side of the room opened. Daniel Harris stepped inside. He didn't rush, he didn't look angry, he didn't even look surprised by the attention turning toward him. He simply walked forward and stopped near the front. For a moment, no one spoke. Linda straightened slightly. "Mr. Harris, this is an HOA internal matter." "It stopped being internal when my property was entered without permission," Daniel said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The room quieted further. A board member quickly spoke up. "We are reviewing the situation." Daniel raised a hand slightly, not in anger, but to pause the discussion. I already reviewed it, he said. That confused a few people. Linda frowned. Reviewed what? Daniel looked at her directly for the first time in the meeting. The footage, he replied, the entry, the removal, the burning. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Linda's expression tightened. I was enforcing HOA compliance. The flag was in violation. It wasn't just a flag, Daniel interrupted quietly. That single sentence changed the tone instantly. Not louder, not dramatic. Just certain. Daniel continued, his voice steady. That item had historical and personal significance recognized under federal memorial guidelines. It was not community property. A few heads turned toward each other. That detail had not been part of any HOA discussion. Linda's expression flickered for the first time. That's not relevant to HOA policy, she said quickly. But something in her voice had shifted. Uncertainty. Daniel nodded slightly, as if he expected that response. It is relevant to what happens next, he said. Before anyone could ask what he meant, a distant sound interrupted the room. 2 vehicles pulling up outside. Then another. Doors closing. Footsteps approaching. The room went quiet. Everyone turned toward the windows. Outside the glass, unfamiliar figures were now visible near the community building entrance, calm, organized, and deliberate in their movement. No one announced themselves loudly. They didn't need to. A knock came at the door. Then it opened. A small group entered, official, composed, and unmistakably authoritative. Their presence wasn't aggressive, but it immediately shifted the energy in the room. The HOA board members stood instinctively. Linda froze. One of the officials spoke briefly, identifying the purpose of their visit in neutral terms. Their attention, however, wasn't on the entire room. It was on Linda, and on the documentation already being reviewed. Daniel stepped slightly aside, allowing them space. He didn't gloat, he didn't speak further. He simply watched. Linda's earlier confidence began to unravel in real time. She looked from the officials to Daniel, then back again, as if trying to reset the situation in her mind. This is a misunderstanding, she said quickly. I was acting under HOA authority. One of the officials raised a hand gently, signaling her to stop. We've reviewed the material, he said evenly. That was all he needed to say. The room felt heavier. Neighbors standing outside the windows now watched in silence as the situation inside shifted completely out of HOA control. Linda's grip on her clipboard loosened slightly. For the first time, she didn't speak immediately. And Daniel Harris, still standing quietly near the front, finally turned his gaze away from her. Because whatever came next was no longer his to argue. It had already moved beyond the neighborhood entirely. By early evening, Maple Ridge Estates no longer felt like the same neighborhood. Word had spread faster than anyone expected, not through gossip this time, but through official channels that most residents didn't fully understand. What began as an HOA dispute had crossed a line no one in the community was prepared for, and the quiet streets now carried a strange tension that made even routine movement feel heavier. People stood behind curtains, cars slowed more than usual. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when unfamiliar vehicles passed through the streets. And then they arrived. It started with the sound of tires on gravel outside the community hall. One vehicle, then another, then a third, pulling in with deliberate spacing as if the timing itself had been calculated. No sirens, no flashing lights, nothing dramatic or theatrical. Just presence. The doors opened and several officials stepped out. Their movements were calm, coordinated, and professional, carrying an unmistakable sense of authority that didn't need explanation. They didn't look rushed. They didn't look uncertain. They looked like people who already knew exactly why they were there. Inside the HOA meeting room, the atmosphere shifted instantly when the first knock came at the door. Linda Morgan had been standing near the front table, still trying to regain control of the situation after the earlier confrontation. Her voice had softened slightly, but her posture remained rigid, as if physical discipline alone could restore order. "This is still an internal HOA matter," she insisted to no one in particular, almost rehearsing the sentence more than stating it. But when the door opened, that illusion collapsed. Daniel Harris stood slightly to the side near the wall, watching quietly as the officials entered. He didn't move forward. He didn't interfere. He didn't need to. Because this was no longer about persuasion. It was about documentation. One of the officials spoke first, his tone neutral but firm. He identified the purpose of their visit in precise terms that immediately shifted the tone in the room. This wasn't a neighborhood discussion anymore. It wasn't even just an HOA issue. It was now a formal review of actions taken against protected property and unauthorized entry. A few HOA board members exchanged uneasy glances. Linda stepped forward quickly. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice tighter now. "I was enforcing community standards. The item in question was non-compliant under HOA regulations." The official didn't react emotionally. He simply glanced at a folder in his hand. "We've reviewed the available footage and reports," he said. That sentence alone drained the remaining confidence from the room. Linda hesitated. "HOA authority allows for." "Your authority does not extend to private entry without consent," he interrupted calmly. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Final silence. Daniel remained still, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture had softened slightly, not relief but confirmation. He had not rushed this. He had not escalated emotionally. He had simply allowed the system to reach its own conclusion. Outside the building, more neighbors had gathered. No one had been called officially, but word travels fast in places where everyone knows everyone. People stood at a distance, watching through windows, trying to understand how a single flag dispute had turned into something this serious. Some looked shocked. Others looked regretful. A few looked like they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Inside, Linda's voice rose again, sharper now. "I was protecting community standards. That flag was deteriorated. It violated HOA guidelines." Daniel finally spoke again, quietly but clearly. "It was not yours to take." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the room. One of the officials turned slightly toward him, acknowledging his statement without needing more explanation. Linda's expression tightened as she looked between Daniel and the officials, realizing that the structure she had relied on, the HOA system, the authority she believed protected her decisions, was no longer the final voice in the room. She was no longer leading anything. She was being evaluated. One of the officials stepped forward slightly, placing a document on the table. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't performative, it was procedural. "This matter will proceed through formal channels," he said simply. "Further actions will be determined based on findings." Linda looked at the paper but didn't touch it. For the first time, she didn't respond immediately. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable for anyone in the room. It was heavy. Finalizing. Daniel turned his gaze briefly toward the empty space outside the window where his flag used to be visible from this angle. No emotion crossed his face outwardly. But something in him had already settled. Because what had started as a complaint had now fully left the control of the neighborhood. And for Linda Morgan, the realization was beginning to sink in. She was no longer enforcing rules. She was answering for them. The morning after the officials left Maple Ridge Estates, the neighborhood felt different in a way no one could quite explain at first. There was no announcement over loudspeakers, no official warning posted on community boards, no dramatic declaration of consequences. Instead, there was silence. The kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Linda Morgan's house was the first place people noticed the change. Her